records in the Irish Military Services Pension Collection, which is housed at Cahill Barracks in Dublin. In recent years, as the files of participants who engaged in the Smashing of the Van episode have become available. They've been digitalised and they can be viewed online. And most of them who were involved have pension files available. And that makes it possible to be able to piece together the actual inside story of the rescue bid. I didn't have access to all of that information at the time. I had some of it when I wrote the book, so that just means I can kind of bring you, maybe a clearer picture of what actually happened. So I'm going to very briefly just mention the historical context, and I'm kind of assuming that most of you will have a kind of a broad understanding of the revolutionary period in Ireland from, let's say, 1916 to 21. So the Irish people in the British general election of 1918 gave Sinn Féin a powerful mandate to establish an Irish Republic as a legitimate government of all Ireland. And consequently, Dáil Éireann was convened in January 1919. In response, the British government declared it illegal and it arrested its deputies. The Irish Republican Army launched a guerrilla war against the Crown forces. The opening shots were at Soloheadbeg in County Tipperary. I know that's been disputed, but that's broadly the understanding. And in order to maintain its authority, England effectively conducted a campaign of terror against the Irish people. And the point of the IRA's military campaign was to force the British to the negotiating table. Now, political developments in Ireland were mirrored in Scotland's large Irish community. According to the census of 1921, there were 65,000 people of Irish birth in Glasgow alone. And the tradition of active involvement by the Irish community in Scotland in their ancestral home's revolutionary movement was deep and long-standing. In fact, there was even two branches or lodges of the United Irishmen in Glasgow in the 1790s. Young Ireland had support as well. In Clydeside, pikes were fashioned in Anderston, so a lot of this has been recorded. But probably the more significant development was the emergence of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, also known as the Fenian Brotherhood, which was established simultaneously in Dublin and New York in 1858. And that organisation spread to Glasgow and Lanarkshire in particular soon after its formation, particularly where you found strong concentrations of Irish, mostly in the industrial belts of Scotland. You found that circles of the Irish Republican Brotherhood started to emerge, and in the IRB's kind of Supreme Council, Scotland always had a representative as well. You had the cultural kind of renaissance at the end of the 19th century, followed in the early 20th century by the emergence of Sinn Féin. And in 1905, Sinn Féin founded a branch in Glasgow, followed 5 years later by in 1910 by the Fine Gael Boy Scouts. The photograph there, that was taken in Bridgeton in August 1915, and that's a troop, or sleur as it's called, of the William Nelson troop of the Fine Gael, and you can see them there. Following that, the Irish Volunteers were formed. That was in reaction to the emergence of the UVF to resist Home Rule for Ireland. And in January of 1914, the West of Scotland Regiment of Oglen of Irish Volunteers was formed on New Year's Day 1914. There's the advert there in the left-hand side. They were actually formed in the Gorbals district of Glasgow in Butte Hall in Norfolk Street. It was an initiative of the GAA, and all the Irish organisations were represented at that. That was a very broad kind of organisation at that time. Now, following that, the following year, Coming a Man, which was the women's kind of auxiliary, they were formed in 1915, and the branch in Glasgow was named after the Irish patriot, comrade of Robert Emmet and Devlin. So they then emerged. And the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was obviously an underground secret revolutionary organisation, it from the outset had a very strong influence over all these organisations. Moving on then, the big development would be the Easter Rising, 1916. And Scotland was very involved in the preparations for the Rising. There was a lot of smuggling of quantities of explosives. A lot of them came from Lanarkshire coal mines. And the members of the Fianna and Coming a Man were at the forefront of those smuggling operations. And Margaret Skinner in particular, who was the captain of the Anne Devlin branch, she, in her book Doing a Bit for Ireland, writes about, smuggling detonators wrapped around their waist and all that, and taking them over, and Coming a Man women basically sewing pockets into dresses that were full of okay, then moving on, that's Charles Carrigan, who was killed in Easter week. He was one of 20 volunteers from the Glasgow Company, which was a company at that time, the only company in Glasgow of the Irish Volunteers. They went over and took part in the Rising, mostly in Dublin, but there was also Glasgow Volunteers fought in Galway and also in Enniscorthy in County Wexford. But Charles Carrigan, he was a lecturer. He was very active in Sinn Féin. He was also in an organisation called the Catholic Socialist Society that was founded by John Wheatley in order to reconcile the tenets of Catholicism and socialism at the time. And he was also quite a popular lecturer amongst them, so he was very well known. And obviously he died in the Rising. It was in the evacuation of the GPO in Moor Lane. He was struck down. So that's Charles Carrigan. Okay, so moving on then. Joe Robinson. Joe Robinson features a lot when you're looking at the whole revolutionary period. Robinson was from Belfast. He was one of the original founders of Fianna Éireann. His family came to Glasgow, lived in Govan Hill. His brother, Seamus Robinson, was one of the big four in the for Tipperary Brigade who came to prominence. Seamus had fought in the Rising. Joe himself was interned because he was captured trying to organise the transportation of explosives. So he was very, very prominent, and he was in the IRB as well as being a captain in the Irish Volunteers. Now he was arrested early on in 1918, so he was kind of out the picture. He spent a lot of time in Peterhead prison, and you had John Carney, who's in the middle there. John Carney, he was technically the officer in command of the Scottish Brigade, But it was more a kind of public image, you know, a kind of public face of the organisation. In 1918, Michael Collins sent one of his kind of men over. His name is Joe Vyse from Wexford. He took a very prominent part in the organisation of transportation of arms and explosives. So he was one of the principal individuals throughout this period. Certainly 1918 to 1920, back to Ireland. That's just headed notepaper for Oglenair, you can see it. Headquarters, 1st Scottish Brigade, Glasgow. Okay. So just moving on then. To see. Yep. With the opening of hostilities in Ireland, the Scottish Brigade was very keen to assist the Republican war effort with a plentiful supply of arms and munitions. The key role of the brigade was the collecting, procuring and purchasing of arms and munitions. It was responsible for their transport, some of which arrived at the port of Leith beside Edinburgh from Germany, and that would be places like Hamburg and Berlin. And then they would go to different centres in Scotland. One of the main depots for a lot of the stuff that came from continental Europe was in the Motherwell area. And thence they would then be transported through various channels to Ireland. Initially, a lot of it came through Ardrossan, through Scotland. Later on, it was more centralised and was taken down to Liverpool. And it went from Liverpool to Ireland. In numerous districts like Lanarkshire, Stirlingshire and Fife, the local IRA company was often composed entirely of miners. Or as in the case of Motherwell, steelworkers, the local steelworkers were also a source of employment. You find that right across when you're looking at the membership for the Scottish Brigade. A lot of the volunteers were miners. Okay, now membership of the brigade expanded greatly from 1919, especially when the guerrilla warfare resumed, the guerrilla war resumed. And at certain times, like after the death of Terence McSweeney, they were inundated with applications. So by the time of the truce in July 1921, there's actually ended up being 2 brigades, because when Joe Vyse came over, he organised the East Coast, Edinburgh and all the different industrial centres there, Winchborough and all that, and right all the way up to Dundee. So the membership, although it fluctuated, stood at approximately 2,500 volunteers. And always volunteers. It was a volunteer army, not a conscription army. They all paid in their dues, and they drilled and they worked really hard, and they took great risks. They took their work seriously. They were a proper brigade. Okay, now that I've kind of given a wee bit of background to the emergence of the Scottish Brigade, I'm now just going to focus more on our story. So the kind of object to the rescue was to free Frank Carty from the prison van. So I'm going to just say a few words about Carty. So he was born in Ballymote, County Sligo in 1897. I'll just get his photo up there for you. That's a colorised photograph of him. As a boy, he became attached to the Sinn Féin organisation and was one of the first and most youthful members of the Irish Volunteers in the west of Ireland. And he joined in 1914. 6 feet tall and of an athletic build, he commanded an air of authority. He had scarcely attained manhood when he was appointed Vice Brigadier of the Sligo Brigade. And in 1921, he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier in the 4th Battalion, South Sligo IRA. The spring of 1920, Carty was captured by the Crown Forces and charged with participation in a daylight raid for arms on the residence of Major Percival of Temple House. In the subsequent trial, he refused to recognise the jurisdiction of the court and was remanded 4 times, and eventually returned for trial to Derry Assizes. While awaiting transfer to Derry, he made a dramatic escape from Sligo jail. The daring escape was planned by the Reverend William Pilkington, formerly officer in command of the Sligo Brigade, and boldly executed that was escaped by his comrades in arms from both North and South Sligo with the assistance of sympathetic prison warders. Carty's sensational escape gave rise to a massive day and night search throughout the county by both police and military, but neither the prisoner nor his rescuers were captured then. After that rescue, Carty commanded a flying column for about 5 months. However, his luck ran out in November in Tubber-Curry when he and 2 others were wounded by Black and Tans. And following a desperate resistance in which he was wounded in the wrist, he was overpowered and carried off to the maximum security jail in Derry City, where he was held throughout the winter. And at this point, I'm just going to show you Charles Mcguinness. So Charlie Mcguinness enters the story. He was a native of Derry City. He was reputed to be the toughest man alive. He had run away to sea at the age of 15, and now 28 years, he held a master's ticket in the North German Lloyd shipping line. His father was a sea captain and ship owner. He was captain of the collier Carrigan, on board which Charlie made many trips to smuggle in arms for the IRA, but routine trips between Derry and Glasgow bored the young Mcguinness, and he sought adventure with the IRA in Donegal. Carty later described him as a swashbuckler to the manner born, slightly over middle height and sturdily built. He walked with a swagger, and on shore he invariably wore a black trench coat and a black trilby hat. He seemed as though it was his intention to display himself, to trail his coat, as it were, and provoke the Royal Irish Constabulary and Black and Tans into some action against him. A dangerous way to go about in dangerous times. Mcguinness was given instructions by the IRA to rescue Carty from Derry jail. And so on the 14th of February 1921, which was the day before his trial was scheduled to open at the Derry Assizes, he made another sensational escape. Derry jail, which is there in the slide, was a medieval fortress built on the side of a steep hill. It was generally regarded a stronghold from which escape was impossible. Through the aid of a friendly warder, a hacksaw and blades were smuggled into the prisoner, and after a few anxious days and nights, the plan eventually worked. Carty made good his escape by sawing through an iron bar 1 3/4 inches square and wrenching it from its sockets, leaving an aperture almost 20 inches long by 10 inches wide, through which he somehow managed to wriggle his large frame. A rope fastened to another bar enabled him to reach an enclosure adjacent to the prison wall. A rope ladder, which reached from the top of this wall to the ground, was afterwards found in the yard of a nearby house, and there was evidence that Carty lowered himself to the ground by means of this ladder. Although it seems certain that an accomplice outside fastened the rope ladder to the top of the wall, nevertheless, the Sligo man ran a considerable risk, and few men of his weight would have attempted to perform such a difficult feat, even with the aid of friends. When his escape was discovered, there was a huge hue and cry in Derry. Police and military with bloodhounds combed the streets and the surrounding countryside for days, but with no result. After remaining in Derry for about 8 or 10 days, Carty was taken from the city by Mcguinness on the Carrigan coal boat to Workington in Cumbria, the north of England. From there, he made his way to Glasgow. According to Carty, in a witness statement he subsequently gave to the Bureau of History and Irish Bureau of Military History, he said that the IRA were notified of his arrival, and he got in touch with them as soon as he arrived in Glasgow. He was in the care of a Dr. Cush for some time, and at the end of about 6 weeks was in perfect health. Whilst in Glasgow, Carty helped to drill and train the volunteers and assisted in the dispatch of arms to Ireland. The police were on the lookout for Carty and another man wanted in Ireland, and as part of their investigations, they raided Francis O'Hagan's house at 69 Abbotsford Place in the Gorbals. There they found Carty lying in bed, and when asked his name, he gave them the alias of Frank Summers. They believed he was one of the men they were looking for. At the time, the police knew that the man they wanted was charged with prison breaking and robbery, but afterwards learned that there was also a charge of murder against him. He appeared before the Central District Court in St Andrews Square and was remanded until the 4th of May. The Glasgow IRA knew that it would only be a matter of time before Carty's real identity was discovered by the authorities, and so they set about making plans to rescue him for the third time. There was no hope of getting him over the walls of Juke Street Prison, they believed, the jail being in the heart of the city and the warders were tough and loyal. The local IRA were soon putting together a daring rescue plan. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of proceed on to the actual ambush. So following his arrest, Frank Carty was twice remanded in custody at the Central Police Court, the second occasion being on the 4th of May, when he was committed to Juke Street Prison for 4 days. It was on the journey from the police court to the prison that the van transporting Carty was ambushed. The following police report of what happened was published in the 5th of May edition of the Glasgow Herald newspaper and reads as follows. But just before I read that, I'm just put up a slide there, which is a composite picture, which shows the scene of the ambush. So you can read that, and it just gives you an idea, the whole kind of where the attacking party was and all that, and the location of the prison van. So I'll just read this now. Detective Constable McDonald reports that at 12:15 p.m. today, while escorting a patrol wagon to Juke Street Prison with Frank Summers, who was charged with theft and prison breaking in Ireland, and another charged with indecent assault, who were under an escort comprising Detective Sergeant George Sturton and Constables David Brown and George Bernard, an attack was made upon the escort. When the wagon was passing the water pumping station in High Street near the corner of Rotten Row, 3 parties of armed men suddenly made their appearance. One at the corner of Rotten Row, one at the southwest corner of Cathedral Square, and the other in the rear immediately started firing. I'm just going to move on some of these slides because I've got quite a few. That's looking at the ambush site, which is a section of the High Street at the top end called the Bell of the Bray, a very historical part of the city. At the corner in the old picture, the guy there with the bonnet, he's just at the corner of Drygate. So just along from him out of sight would have been the entrance to the prison. And you can see the van there. That was just at that point, the van coming up was where it would have been ambushed. And that's a photograph taken just recently, fairly recently, of the same, just taken from the same spot, more or less. Just so you can get a sense of where it is. Okay, we'll just carry on. See now. Driver Thomas Ross had occasion at this point to change the gear for the purpose of turning into the prison when the wagon stopped. So it was at the steepest point of the gradient that the ambush happened. Inspector Johnson, who was in charge of the escort and occupied a seat to the left of the driver, was shot through the heart on the first discharge of shots. He fell off the wagon onto the roadway and almost immediately expired. I'm just going to move these on because there's a lot of them. Detective Sergeant Sturton jumped from the front of the wagon and, standing across the body of the inspector, discharged the revolver at the assailants. He had fired only one shot when he received a bullet through the right wrist and was thus incapacitated from firing. Detective Constable McDonald, who also occupied a seat in the front of the wagon, emptied his revolver at the assailants on the left and those at the corner of the prison wall. There are several bullet marks on the wagon, and you can see the policeman there pointing to one of the bullet marks at the back of the prison van. 3 had pierced the radiator, 1 went through the mud screen, and several through the windscreen. A bullet had been fired into the locks of the doors of the wagon, and a couple of shots had been fired into the outside of the wagon below the driver's seat. Okay, so that's the kind of official account. It will be disputed when you get the Republican account of what happened, but that was the official version. So word of the drama was to reach Glaswegian some hours later, when the 3 evening newspapers, the Times, the News and Citizen, splashed news of the sensation. Some called it the Glasgow Outrage, others the Glasgow Atrocity. The description of what had so dramatically occurred was given in full under such subheadings as Grim Fight Under Shadow of Gallows. So I'll just show you some of these images. Right, that's the spot there of the ambush where the van was. You can see the prison wall at the back, and then the prison buildings behind that. So there's a few images here. You can see where the van halted on the left, Constable Bernard in the middle, and you can see one of the bullet marks is a number on them there, but you can see that one more clearly. Yep, that was one of the standard issued pistols that the police kind of escort party would have been issued with. Constable Thomas Ross, the driver, is seen with the bullet-riddled police van. We can see where several shots pierced the radiator and the windscreen was smashed. And that's the headline front page of the Daily Record. Just says disorders follow Glasgow Sinn Féin outrage, city ambush murder. There's a picture there of Inspector Robert Johnston. Sinn Féin gunmen attacked police van. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see the composite picture that I showed you earlier. Okay. Okay, so moving on then. The newspaper reports, whilst diverging in some particulars, are substantially identical. Press accounts differ as to the effect of the fusillade on the door of the van. The Daily Record says that one of the assailants, more daring than his fellows, ran into the roadway behind the van just before it started off. Pointing its pistol at the doorway, he fired a shot at the lock. The door sprung open. However, as the Glasgow Herald correctly reports, the locks were destroyed, but the doors held, and the plans of the would-be rescuers failed. Several newspapers detailed, I'll show you that, detailed the careers of the wounded policeman and his deceased colleague. Police Inspector Johnson was 41 years of age and was married with 2 children. He was a native of Castle Douglas and joined the Glasgow Police in 1902. For several years, he served in the Eastern Division, where he held the rank of sergeant and was in charge of the organisation of the special constables of the division during the war. 2 years before his death, he was promoted inspector and was appointed court officer at the Central Division. His duties were included the calling of the cases in the court and generally the handing over of the prisoners to the officials in Juke Street Prison. And it mentions that Inspector Johnson resided in Shettleston. Now, the rescue attempt was just one of many actions carried out by the IRA during this period. The Anglo-Irish War was raging and there were daily battles between Republicans and the Crown forces. In the greatest operation in the west of Ireland in the War of Independence, a successful ambush against superior British forces in Tourmakeady, County Mayo, took place the day before on the 3rd of May, which resulted in 10 British soldiers being casualties against 2 IRA losses. On the day of the Glasgow ambush itself, there had been a spectacular and deadly ambush of a 9-man RIC patrol in County Kerry, where only 1 officer survived. This was also a time of industrial unrest throughout Britain, and in Glasgow there were strikes in the docks and on the tramcars. Crews of ships, gas supply workers and railwaymen were all on strike. And on the day of the rescue bid, it was the 27th day of a miners' strike. So there's obviously a lot of industrial unrest going on as well. So looking at the aftermath then, the Chief Constable of Glasgow, James Vernon Stevenson, was determined to bring those responsible for the ambush to book. A native of Athlone in County Westmeath, Stevenson joined the Royal Irish Constabulary in 1884 and rose to the rank of District Inspector in Belfast at a time of considerable unrest in the city. He was heavily involved in the Bloody Friday riot in George Square in 1919, and many critics blamed him for starting the riots when he ordered his men to clear the streets. In a letter dated the 4th of May 1921, sent to the Under Secretary for Scotland, Stevenson gives a concise report of the ambush and states that, in view of the possibility of an attempted rescue, a strong escort was placed on the van. Okay, moving on. Oops, let's try and get that back, sorry. The police wasted no time in trying to investigate the attack in the van and the killing of their colleague. They concentrated their efforts in districts which housed the majority of the city's Irish community, and within a few hours, many people with known Sinn Féin connections were apprehended. One of those arrested was the Reverend Patrick McCrory, a young curate at St Mary's Parish in Abercrombie Street in the Calton, which is in the East End of Glasgow. When the detectives visited the presbytery to arrest him, news of the visit spread rapidly in the neighbourhood and large crowds assembled round the house. Presently, the detectives emerged, accompanied by the parish priest, Father Fitzgerald, and Father McCrory. It was stated that only Father McCrory was under arrest and that Father Fitzgerald was merely accompanying his curate to the police office in Tobago Street. Popular resentment was freely expressed, and a reported 2,000 people gathered on the streets, and missiles were thrown at the police, who drew their batons to ward off attacks. The positions seemed so grave on the night of the ambush that a detachment of Gordon Highlanders wearing steel helmets and carrying fixed bayonets was brought from Maryhill Barracks to assist the police to cope with the rioting. 5 other arrests were made in the same street, and excitement prevailed until a late hour, a passing tram car being attacked on its way through Abercrombie Street. The windows of 10 shops were smashed in the Gallowgate. The streets were eventually cleared, Father Fitzgerald having appealed to the people to disperse. But for some time, there continued to be great excitement in the district. A military guard was placed on the police station. This wasn't the first time that the ordinary people of the Calton came face to face with military might. In what has been regarded as the first generation of Red Clydesiders, 6 weavers were slaughtered and many others wounded by the Dorset militia in 1787, when they dared to demonstrate for the right to work and a living wage. St Mary's Parish had a large Irish population, and in the crypt of the church are buried 5 Irish priests who died in 1847 of the prevailing epidemic of fever. For many years, there existed a district in the Calton known as Connaught Square by the people of Glasgow because it continued the language and traditions of the west of Ireland. The newspapers reported that at the Eastern Police Court, 8 men and 4 women were remanded in connection with the disturbance in Abercrombie Street, which followed Father McCrory's arrest. A statement printed in the evening paper of Thursday and alleging that the police entered the church during service while 2 priests were in the confessional box was denied. The police went straight to the sacristy and to the priest's house. On the 5th of May, the arrested prisoners were brought before Stipendiary Nielsen at Glasgow Central Police Court and formally charged. They were of various ages, ranging from 19 to 58 years. Nearly all bore Irish names, and 12 of the 20, it was disclosed on the charge sheet, were born in Ireland. Almost without exception, they were described as being alert, very alert and intelligent. There were a total of 20 prisoners in all. Their names being Sean Adair, age 19, James Fullerton, 22, Bernard Cunningham, 47, Father McCrory, 26, Thomas Tracy, 45, his wife Mary Tracy, 17, Francis O'Hagan's 38, Mary McInerney, 36, Alice McInerney, 39, and Elizabeth McInerney, 41. They were three sisters from Trefoil Street in Shawlands. William Fullerton, or Liam Fullerton, who was he was a brother of James Fullerton. You had Annie Murray, 27, Patrick Campbell, 38, Michael O'Carroll, 19, John McGarrigle, 26, Vincent Campbell, 20, James McCara, 25, James Mitchell, 28, Charles Greer, 36. That was two pseudonyms, or aliases rather. Jane Campbell, 26. Okay, so all were charged with having, while attempting to rescue a prisoner, discharged loaded firearms, to have killed Inspector Johnson, and thirdly, wounding Detective Sergeant Sturton. No pleas were taken and all were remanded in custody for 48 hours. More arrests followed, and a week after the rescue attempt, 34 prisoners were in custody, many of whom had been found in possession of firearms and ammunition. The arms referred to in one of the charges was the discovery in a cellar of the largest haul of IRA arms and explosives ever found in Glasgow. That was at 74 Abercrombie Street, which just faced the chapel. There were 35 revolvers, 6 hand grenades, a bomb, many pounds of gelignite, a large number of detonators, 8 bags of percussion caps, 955 rounds of revolver and rifle ammunition, holsters, magazines, a bayonet, and a coil of fuse wire. So it was a large haul. Moving on. Application was made on behalf of the police that the prisoners be remanded until Saturday, the May the 7th. The application not being opposed, Stipendiary Nielsen granted the remand. None of the prisoners had representation from a solicitor. The prisoners were held behind the grim walls of Juke Street Prison. Juke Street Prison was built back in the 1790s. It was originally called the Bridewell, which was the original name of Kilmainham Jail as well. The conditions were notoriously poor with chronic overcrowding. During this period, a range of political prisoners, including suffragettes, socialists, anarchists, and Irish Republicans, were sent to the prison. Some went on hunger strike to protest their treatment. Executions of ordinary prisoners were carried out in Juke Street from 1865 to 1928. At the Eastern Police Court, 12 people were charged with forming part of a riotous crowd and conducting themselves in a disorderly manner the previous night following the arrest of Father McCrory. I might add, incidentally, that the IRA in Glasgow were inundated with applications to join after the arrest of Father McCrory, but they put the applications on hold because they felt a lot of it was an emotional reaction to the arrests, rather than any kind of ideological commitment to republicanism. So that was something I came across I thought was interesting. So moving on, the fact that the detectives who were escorting Carty to Juke Street Prison carried revolvers seems to have given rise to the mistaken impression that all police officers were now armed, and it was officially stated that the 4th of May was the first time for many years in which any police official accompanying a prison van had been furnished with firearms. Evidently, the police were taking no chances with Frank Carty, given his 2 previous jailbreaks and his high-ranking position in the IRA. The authorities would have appeared to have seized on the rescue attempt as an excuse for repressive measures against the more advanced sections of the Labour movement. The premises of the Scottish Labour College in St Vincent Street were raided at midnight on the 4th of May, but nothing incriminating was found. The following day, Tom Mitchell, secretary of the Socialist Labour Party and editor of the Socialist newspaper, was arrested and charged with writing a seditious article. This was possibly revenge for the fact that the Socialist Labour press printed the Sinn Féin newspaper, Dark Rosaleen. John McLean commented, quotes, "Underneath lies the idea that a Bolshevik plot is still brewing and that we communists are linked up with the Sinn Féiners," close quotes. That Thursday, McLean addressed a huge meeting at Barrhead where he referred to the death of the police inspector. He counselled Irishmen and Scottish workers not to resort to violence, but to calmly watch the developments. This is no plea for passive inactivity, but for refusal to resort to childish displays of petty force when the government is ready to give us a deluge of blood. And I should add, McLean was very popular amongst the Irish in Glasgow. Not only did he organise propaganda support, he had a Hands Off Ireland campaign, he spoke throughout industrial sections of Scotland in relation to the Black and Tan Terror, but he also organised through his contacts with the miners to arrange for explosives for the Scottish Brigade. And he produced a pamphlet in 1920 called Ireland's Tragedy, Scotland's Disgrace, which was really a case for ending the terror, and also the fact that Scottish soldiers, or British soldiers who were Scots, were actually involved in, as Celts, suppressing their fellow Celts. So he was very highly respected for his stance. The newspaper of the Independent Labour Party Forward endorsed the view expressed in the Glasgow Observer, which was the paper of the Irish Catholic community, that the killing of Inspector Johnson poisoned host-immigrant relations and failed to advance the cause the Republicans sought to promote. It stated that the result was the immediate interruption again of that cursed anti-Irish, or rather anti-Catholic prejudice, which has for 100 years kept the working class split into sections, and which only in the last decade have we got partially smothered. And not only that, but the growing sympathies of the Protestant and of the Protestant and other non-Catholic workers for the Irish people under the vicious Greenwood Lloyd George terror have suddenly withered. You can hear the anti-Sinn Féin rumble on every hand. And as in England, the burning of farm stacks, warehouses and hotel bedrooms by alleged Sinn Féiners had resulted in the strengthening of the reactionary forces there. So too it will be in Scotland. It's worth mentioning that May Day in 1919, 100,000 workers marched to George Square to celebrate May Day, and the principal speaker was Countess Markievicz, who had been recently appointed as Minister for Labour, and that marked a kind of shift in sentiment, whereby there was a lot of support within the Scottish Labour movement for the Irish cause. And if you look at the Scottish Trade Union Congress resolutions throughout this period, they were pretty forceful in their opposition to British repression in Ireland, and they called for self-determination. So there was a lot of goodwill and support within the wider Scottish community, especially kind of Labour movement circles. So moving on, the newspapers reported that Inspector Johnson's funeral took place on the 7th of May after a service at Shettleston. The coffin contained his body was conveyed to his native Castle Douglas. The Glasgow Herald stated that on the part of the general public, the funeral procession through the streets of the city was the occasion for a striking tribute of sympathy. On the 7th of May, armed members of the Royal Irish Constabulary escorted Frank Carty to Holyhead, where he was placed on board a naval vessel and taken to Dublin, where he was placed in Mountjoy Jail. In what was described as a sensational sequel to the ambush, the Glasgow Herald on the 9th of May reported that the Chief Constable was sent 2 letters of a threatening and intimidating character towards the police. They purported to have been sent by the IRA and Sinn Féin, and to make references to the arrest of Father McCrory, and demanded his release. It is unlikely, however, that either of the handwritten letters came from the sources claimed. One is signed President of the Council of the Irish Republican Army, which was a non-existent designation. It's more than likely that some enraged individual who believed the false rumour that the police entered the chapel of St Mary's to arrest Father McCrory would have composed the letters. Father McCrory was a native of Deer Park in Omagh in County Tyrone. Was by all accounts a very popular young priest. His first curacy, which was to be his only pastoral charge, was St Mary's, where he'd served for less than 2 years before his arrest. During the detention of Father McCrory, the Glasgow Observer commented on the reaction to the young priest's arrest. His arrest and detention have aroused an unprecedented feeling in eastern Glasgow, and the utmost sympathy has been manifested by the people of St Mary's in the best possible way, by intercession to the Almighty for the young priest's speedy release. The all-night vigil in St Mary's Church on Tuesday night was one of the most remarkable religious services in the record of the Church in Scotland. It began practically without any preparation or announcement, but the news that it was to take place got around the parish like wildfire. Before midnight, the church was packed to the door. Confessions were heard during the night by the clergy of the parish, assisted by other priests from neighbouring missions, and the number of communicants at the morning mass was enormous. The article went on to state, if a plebiscite of Glasgow Catholics were taken to decide who at present is the city's most popular clergyman, there can be no doubt that the choice would fall upon Reverend Patrick McCrory of St Mary's, and his warmest advocates would be his fellow clergy. Indeed, it's highly probable that not a single vote would be cast elsewhere, that Father McCrory would have a walkover. Until a few weeks ago, this young priest was practically unknown. Today, his name is on everyone's lips, and his welfare is the burden of thousands of prayers offered on his behalf by the faithful Irish Catholic people of Scotland's greatest city. By what means has he attained such unparalleled popularity? His fame is not of his own seeking, for there is no more modest, retiring, pious and hard-working priest to be found anywhere. But like the overwhelming majority of Glasgow Irish people, he has Sinn Féin sympathies. Also, he assiduously visits the Catholic families of the district. To these two circumstances, mainly he owes the fact that he is at present the occupant of a cell in Juke Street prison and the white-headed boy of his co-religionists in the city. He is ever in their thoughts. While detained in Juke Street prison, Father Pat, as parishioners affectionately knew him, wrote home to his mother, and the letter dated 18th of July 1921 has been carefully preserved in the family homestead. He wrote about his hopes of being released, about letters he had had from his mother, brother and friends. He asked his mother, if you have time, you might send a sheet of newspaper, a stamped addressed envelope, a pen and ink to Minnie, who was his sister. If there is not a shortage of the above items in Rock Row, then I can't account for her silence. Some further inquiries about the family and whether are made in the letter before turning to the truce and the negotiations between the Irish government and Lloyd George's cabinet. Father Pat asks, what do you think of the prospects of peace in Ireland? Things look hopeful, more hopeful than they did for a long time. It does seem that the British government are in earnest about it. The truce, and that broke out in July of 1921, which is only a few months after the ambush. Said the truce and the implied recognition of the IRA show that everyone would be glad if something comes from the present conferences. There was a Triduum in St Mary's last week for that intention. Father McCrory had his morale lifted in prison by friends telling him stories of great Glasgow Celtic players like Sandy McMahon, Jimmy Quinn and Patsy Gallagher. He must have been proud that his beloved Celtic was founded in the parish hall of St Mary's to raise money for the poor of the East End 33 years earlier. It was also said that the Rory O'Moore flute band played Irish airs outside the prison to raise his spirits. Father McCrory is supposed to acknowledge this show of support by waving a green handkerchief from his cell window. Further arrests were made in the days following the ambush, bringing the number of people held in custody in connection with the rescue attempt to 32. The Chief Constable was dealt a serious personal blow when his son D.I. Stevenson of the RIC was one of 6 British forces killed in an IRA ambush on the 3rd of June at Carroll Kennedy in County Mayo. There was no let-up in the police investigation, and the arrest of James Sherry in June was to be followed in July by the arrests in Edinburgh of 3 men whom the police had been keen to detain. They were Shane Mooney, his brother Eamon Mooney, and Freddie Quinn, who it was reported had served in the Gordon Highlanders. Most of those originally charged with offences relating to the ambush were subsequently released. On the 22nd of July, 11 men and 7 women were freed, the case against them having been withdrawn. I'll not give you their names, it's quite long. Father McCrory, Shaddad was one of them. Now, moving on. A crowd of several thousand gathered outside St Mary's Church to welcome Father McCrory and his release. From many, this is a report now from the Glasgow Observer, from many windows Irish Republican flags were displayed, and near the chapel a green banner stretched across the street bearing the words Cydmila Fulci. About 6 o'clock, a motor car conveying Father McCrory, who was accompanied by the Reverend Father Fitzgerald and the Reverend Father McEwen, reached the vicinity of the chapel. An immense crowd surrounded the car, and Father McCrory, who had to acknowledge repeated outbursts of cheering, was almost carried from the car to the Presbytery House entrance. A number of Irish songs were sung by the demonstrators, including the Soldier's Song and God Save Ireland, the local press reported. The Glasgow Observer reported on the scenes that greeted Father McCrory upon his release from Duke Street Prison. From dawn on Friday morning, the news seemed to have spread far and wide, and Calton joyfully set itself the task of preparing a suitable welcome for its Sogar Farun, this beloved priest. Unroll Erin's flag, fling its folds to the breeze, let it wave o'er the land, let it float to the seas. The green, white and gold of Ireland simply obliterates the deep frontages of Abercrombie Street and the adjacent network of thoroughfares, and it was through an avenue of Sinn Féin flags that one approached St Mary's Presbytery, around which had congregated thousands of Irish people, almost frantic with joyful exuberance at the prospect of welcoming their young priest. Cydmila Fulci was a cheering, welcoming legend on a great banner stretched across Abercrombie Street. Myriads of Sinn Féin flags fluttered in the breeze, the heraldic banners of the 4 provinces floating proudly above the throng. The chapel house was gaily beflagged, and from Father McCrory's own window streamed a great Sinn Féin standard with the red hand of Ulster on its central panel. Hundreds of children dressed in green paraded in the street. Father McCrory was the first of the released prisoners to appear from the prison gateway in an open car. He received an enthusiastic welcome from the crowd, which, numbering several hundred, had mustered in the Brigade. Shortly before 6, the car conveying Father Fitzgerald and Father McCrory was seen by thousands in Abercrombie Street. Perhaps ironically, I should add that Abercrombie Street was named after someone who was a leading member of the British Army in Ireland, leading officer, so just thought I'd throw that in there. The scene of welcome defies description. He was carried down from the car to the presbytery. A baby girl brought for baptism in St Mary's on that Friday was given a name commemorative of the day. She is Elizabeth McCrory O'Reilly. A Defence of Irish Political Prisoners Scotland Fund was created to raise money to pay for the hefty legal costs of the trial, and various fundraising events were undertaken. British intelligence sources claimed that the Catholic clergy helped organise a Gaelic fair in the grounds of Kenmure House in Bishopbriggs on June 11th and 12th. According to the report, about 15,000 attended on the first day and about 20,000 on the second, with upwards of £1,000 being raised. So I'll move on to the trial. Now, when I wrote the book, I spent a lot of time on the trial and the minutiae of it, but I'm just going to mention it fairly briefly. So, of the 34 originally charged, only 13 were sent to the High Court in Edinburgh. Against each of the accused, the Crown listed an additional charge of conspiracy, making 4 charges in all. All the accused pleaded not guilty, and the trial opened on the 8th of August 1921 before the Lord Justice Clerk and a jury consisting of 7 men and 8 women. Now this is quite significant. historically. The press remarked that this was the first trial in which a capital charge was involved, in which there has been ladies in the jury, close quote. Now, that was okay. So the Solicitor General conducted the case for the Crown, and an imposing array of counsel appeared for the defence. Detective Sergeant Sturton gave a graphic account of the attack. He told the court that when he and Detective Constable MacDonald were issued with revolvers, they received strict instructions not to use the weapons unless attacked. About the actual attack, Sturton said that when the van was about 15 yards from the Brigade, he heard a shot coming from the rear, and that at the same time, 3 men came from the direction of the prison wall. They lined up on the pavement, and resting their revolvers on their left arms, they opened fire in the van. Detective Sturton positively identified 9 of the accused and was subjected to a grueling cross-examination by defending counsel. He was accused of firing first, then asked how, in all the excitement of the attack, he was able to identify so many of the accused. The case for the Crown mainly rested on identification. Against this, counsel for the defence produced witnesses to provide an alibi for each of the accused. Counsel also severely criticised police methods of identification, alleging that police witnesses were given a preview of the accused while they were in Juke Street Prison, which enabled them to identify the defendants later at an identification parade. The trial lasted 11 days, and with the jury accepting the defensive alibi, 6 of the accused were found not guilty, and the charges against the others were found not proven. All the accused were accordingly acquitted. However, one of them, Daniel Patrick Walsh, was immediately rearrested. He was actually had escaped previously from Strangeways prison in Manchester in 1919, and he was one of the party that disappeared with Austin Stack. Parliament Square was kept comparatively clear of the public during the sitting, but a large crowd, which you can see there in the slide, collected in the High Street to hear the verdict, and the news created unbounded delight to a considerable section of it, many people waving miniature green flags. Having provided the account of the trial and the verdicts in the Glasgow prison van case, as reported in the Glasgow Observer, the next chapter will piece together the inside story of the attempt to rescue Brigadier Frank Carty from the prison van. So I'll start off by describing the official rescue plan that was conceived by Charles Mcguinness, and it was authorised by the Defence Minister, Michael Collins, General Headquarters in Dublin. I will then describe the Glasgow plan to hold up the prison van, which is the one that was actually enacted on the 4th of May. The account of the rescue attempt is drawn mainly from the participants themselves, as recorded in witness statements supplied to the Bureau of Military History, and also individual pension files in the military service pension collection. I'm also indebted to the late Kathleen Knowles McGurk for a handwritten statement by her late uncle Shane Mooney, who described his own part in the ambush. I've also used the recollections of the rescue bid as related to the journalist John Cooney by Michael O'Carroll, who took part, and is edited from 3 hours of tape-recorded reminiscence and interviews plus notes. The official plan to free Carty is described in the autobiography of Charles Mcguinness. It's called Nomad, which was recently republished. It's also retold in Liam Mellow's in the Irish Revolution, a book by Charles Desmond Greaves. Having examined all these sources, it is difficult to piece together exactly the events that led to the death of Inspector Johnson and Mcguinness Sturton, but we get an idea. So I'll just proceed. So the official plan. Charles Mcguinness, the man who rescued Carty from Derry jail, once again enters the story. One day, while resting in the Donegal Hills, a dispatch bearer approached one of the sentries. He carried his dispatch for Mcguinness from the officer in command of the IRA in Derry, Paddy Shields, enclosing another from Dublin. The letter stated that Frank Carty, the Sligo commandant, had been arrested in Glasgow and would be sent back to Derry under heavy guard. for execution. The name of the steamer was given and the probable date of the sailing. Under this factual statement was a terse message written in Gaelic as follows: I want you to investigate this problem, and if there is any way of effecting a rescue, I want you to try, and I'm confident of your ability to succeed. Regards, signed Michael Collins. Collins, who was Director of Intelligence for the IRA, signed the dispatch with an on-the-plume known only to Republican commanders. So, accompanied by 6 men armed with automatics and carrying 20 rounds of ammunition each, Mcguinness set out for Glasgow aboard the Carrigan. He conceived a plan involving nothing less than piracy in the high seas. They planned to return on the boat with Carty and attempt a rescue at sea. Mcguinness was confident he could get Carty over the side into a small craft. He knew that the steward of the ship and several members of the crew, being sympathetic to the Republican cause, could be depended upon to assist. Mcguinness recollects the episode in his book Nomad. Dressed as labourers and carrying red bandanas to secrete our guns, we submitted ourselves to the scrutiny of the guards at the gangway and then took up our steerage quarters. The stewards and friendly members of the crew, when called into our confidence, swore to help our plans to capture the vessel on its return with Carty. We carried sufficient medical dope to paralyse the whole British Army, and the steward agreed to brew a pot of tea for the sentries on the return trip at the appointed time, heavily charged with the anaesthetic. Then, when they had succumbed to the drug, we would take the keys and unlock the strong room in which Carty would be held prisoner. At this stage, we would ascend the bridge, hold up the skipper and his officers, and stop the ship when abreast in its shown head on the Derry-Donegal border. So the Glasgow IRA were notified of the plan in a letter from the officer in command of the Derry Brigade, dated the 3rd of April, which read, "We have a plan whereby Frank C may be taken from the escort on board the steamer to Derry. A lot depends on the assistance you can arrange on your side." And the letter was personally delivered by George Armstrong, an intelligence officer in the Derry Brigade. He worked in the Scotch boat, as it was called, and was a courier between Dublin, Derry and Glasgow. But the plan was doomed even as it was made. So the unofficial plan now. So when Mcguinness, who was using the alias of Hennessy, and his comrades arrived in Glasgow, they proceeded to the Sinn Féin headquarters at 171 in Field Street. And that was the site of the old, now demolished STV studios at the very top of Enfield Street. So arrived to find the place a beehive of industry. The premises were jammed with men busily overhauling Colt 45s, Webleys, Smith & Wessons and other less modern weaponry. Mcguinness takes up the story. Promptly I gave my credentials to the commanding officer and stated the purpose of my mission. He frowned and shook his head. "Sorry, Hennessy, but we have decided to stage the rescue right here in Glasgow. We'll stick up the prison van in an hour's time. I have every hope of success. If I call off our attack," went on the commander, "it would shatter the whole Republican movement here. Anyway, I doubt if they'd obey me, so our original scheme will have to prevail." Probably you're right," I agreed, "but I'm afraid you'll never get Frank Carty out of a prison van in broad daylight in the heart of Glasgow." Mcguinness was not the only Republican to hold this opinion. Liam Mellis, sorry, I should have turned that earlier. Not paying attention, okay, sorry. So Liam Mellis, who was the Quartermaster General of the IRA, was made aware of the local plan whilst in Glasgow on army business. He attended a meeting at Elliott's Public House, the Bunch of Grapes at Paisley Road Toll. There he found the local men discussing a desperate adventure, which was no less than a repetition of the Manchester rescue of 1867. And if you're aware of that, that was a famous episode that resulted in the hanging of 3 Irishmen, Alan, Larkin and O'Brien. But moving on, according to Seamus Reader, who was an officer in the Glasgow IRA, He says, I got a summons to go to Tom Elliott's house on the night of the 3rd of May. DP Walsh, now DP Walsh was the assistant commander of the IRA attached to General Headquarters Staff, so he was in Glasgow as well, also in army business, and he was explaining to Mellows that some of the 1st Battalion officers and the Brigade officer in command, John Carty, had decided to attempt to rescue Carty from the custody of the Glasgow police. So that's DP Walsh there. He was from Fairvard, if I'm pronouncing it right, in County Tipperary. And Daniel Braniff, he was also, he'll come up into the story later, he was also a GHQ representative. He was previously in Scotland and very involved in the IRB, Sinn Féin, and he was a Belfast man. So moving on, Seamus Reader said that Mellows asked me rather sharply what was my position in the affair. I said I knew nothing of the plans the Glasgow officers had made. Mellows was against this rescue and advised strongly that it should be called off. He said it would create police activity and that some of our arms, etc., might be captured. He also said it might cause a disruption in the supply and transport of arms to Ireland. Walsh told Mellows that arrangements had gone too far for it to be cancelled, and the rescue would have to be carried out. He said the Glasgow officers were determined to carry it out, and that if he asked them to cancel it, there would be a terrible hubbub. Reader goes on to state, I had already explained to Mellows that the Glasgow police were an unarmed force, and if they attacked, we might lose the support of the Scottish people. Reader then stated that in order to give Walsh an excuse for calling off the attack, I suggested the attempt should be postponed until Carty was handed over to the RIC escort, which would be over shortly, to bring him back to Ireland. The rescue could be attempted when they were bringing him to the boat. Reader claims that Walsh was in agreement and said he would go to the meeting at Campbell's house on Abercrombie Street to make the final plans for the attack. He would ask the officers to agree to it and tell them he was acting on the advice of another GHQ officer, namely Liam Mellows. Mellows cautioned against this in favour of the official plan and argued that it would be foolish to jeopardise the flow of arms by rousing a public outcry in Scotland. But the plans were already in motion for the rescue bid to be enacted the following day. Anticipating the wave of arrests that followed, Mellows wisely left Glasgow at once. One of the Glasgow volunteers, Joe Booker, recalls that a meeting was held in the evening of the 3rd of May in Abercrombie Street, across from St Mary's Church in the house of Vincent Campbell, so that's number 74, at the request of Commandant DP Walsh. He states that arrangements were made to attack the prison van the following day. Booker noted that among those present at the meeting was Father McCrory, the young curate, who was also a chaplain in the 1st Battalion of the Scottish Brigade, Daniel Braniff, GHQ representative from Belfast, John Carney, who was kind of the nominal officer in command, who was a barber in Govan and commanding officer of the Scottish Brigade. Sean Flood from Dublin was there as an brigade adjutant, and Captain Seamus Fullerton was selected to lead the operation on the day because it would take place in the catchment area of his company. DP Walsh addressed the logistical problem of which one of several vans leaving the Central District Court would convey Frank Carty to the prison. Walsh arranged that a member of Cumann would cycle ahead of Carty's van. She would be tipped off by an old woman who was a cleaner in the Central Police Station. Walsh gave this woman a description of Carty. Her instruction was to throw out her bucket and mop as Carty's van was about to leave. This would be the signal for the Cumann member to start pedalling up the hill and alert the volunteers, who would be waiting in readiness to ambush the van and free their comrade. The IRA volunteers selected to take part in the rescue attempt were all members of a flying column or active service unit and were chiefly used for operations in the west of Scotland and occasionally as far east as Leith and Edinburgh. They were selectively recruited from various companies in the 1st Battalion area and consisted of between 20 and 30 men. At this meeting, Michael O'Carroll and Joe Booker were instructed to mobilise 16 men in the active service unit to take part in the rescue attempt and detail them where to assemble the following morning. The 2 men visited houses in Maryhill and Springburn and the surrounding areas. The landladies in most cases were very indignant and demanded to know why we wanted the men at this time of night. Both men were also tasked with visiting the dumps to lift the required arms to supply the attacking party. And Booker, who did not take part in the ambush, recalls having to obtain a sledgehammer to be used to force the door of the prison van open. They also had to spend time arranging alibis for the men, which kept them busy well into the next morning. Booker recalls delivering 6 automatic weapons on the morning of the attack to his commandant D.P. Walsh at the Ivanhoe Hotel in Buchanan Street. That's the Central Police Court there, where the van left. It just faces St Andrews in the square. And that's the brothers Eamon and Shane Mooney, who took a prominent part in the ambush. Shane Mooney, who, as we shall see, played an active role in the rescue attempt, gives the following description, a detailed account of the ambush. We boarded a tram at 9:30 a.m. to meet the men at the appointed rendezvous. In those days, most of the trams had an open vestibule front and rear. We proceeded to the upper deck of the vehicle and passed along the front opening, which was divorced from the main portion by a sliding door. There were 3 people already seated on the limited horseshoe seat, and to our surprise, we recognised them as an officer and 2 other members of A Company. It was impossible to sit with them and maintain a rigid silence, as our friendship was mutual. To our great relief, we discovered, after a few introductory remarks, that their interest in the weather was every bit as keen as ours. When we had exhausted all the vagaries of the atmosphere phenomena, we still had a few stops to go. I was on the verge of saying this is where we got off when their leader, Seamus Fullerton, suddenly stood up and said that this was their destination. I sighed with relief. We got to the toll booth, which some of you'll know is just at the foot of the High Street at Glasgow Cross. And we noticed some men from B Company hanging around, and we approached them. We were hardly 5 minutes together when we were accosted by our 3 fellow travellers who had also been mobilised. I suppressed an inward chuckle on seeing them once more, but I also felt an inward pride, like knowing that although we all espoused the one cause, we never talked about a job to each other until we were positive that the other person was engaged on the same mission. At 10 o'clock, we received orders to form into smaller groups and designate 1 man from each to meet at a certain cafe in London Street, which was the then name for London Road, where we would receive fuller instructions about what was to take place. 5 of our men were left, I think, in Hanover Street, and Captain Quinn, my brother, and I repaired to the cafe. We received further orders from the Commandant about the intended engagement, and he told us in detail what it was. The men were to be divided into 3 groups, which would cooperate but not merge. The 3 parties consisted of a reconnoitring unit, or outpost, a labour section, and an attacking column. I was in the latter. He then explained to us to get in touch with our respective parties and get our men posted immediately. There were 6 men placed on outpost duty every 100 yards or so from the court to within 200 yards of the prison. The labour section kept together without drawing attention unduly. 1 unit grouped for a few moments to receive our post positions. When the captain told us to go to our stations, we broke up casually. My instructions were to go to the far side of the street facing the prison wall. When I surveyed the situation, I found that I was isolated, being the only armed man. The word is unclear, side of the vehicle, which is all handwritten, this account. On the jail side were at least 4 men, and further up at the turn of the wall were 2 others. I thought this a grave error of judgment, for on thinking of the engagement in an anticipatory manner, I realised that not only would I be in grave danger from my own men's fire, but if they succeeded in forcing the occupants of the van out, I should not be able to cope with them myself. As it so transpired, this contretemps almost happened. At 12:45 midday, I was watching one of the Labour unit crossing the street with a 3-foot parcel under his arm. What looked suspiciously like a crowbar. I later learned that when he went into action, it was a sledgehammer. When I noticed our sergeant signalling a few minutes later, the van loomed into sight. I'm just going to show you another recreation of the ambush. It was in one of the newspapers at the time, just to give you a sense of it all. Okay, so he says, the psychological moment having arrived, I tensed myself inwardly, but to the passer-by, I was only a young man, casually leaning against a lamp standard. I placed my hand in my pocket and crooked the trigger of my Smith & Wesson .45. When the vehicle was 10 yards away, I noticed 4 men in the driver's cabin. They seemed to be alert and tense, as though expecting something to happen. They were not disappointed. When the car drew abreast of me, I stepped off the path and hesitated to give the occupants the impression that I only wished to cross the street. In another instant, I sprang on the running board and grabbed the windscreen. When I ordered them to stop the van, they didn't seem to hear. The reason being that one of the men in front stepped out to the middle of the road, stooped on one knee and pointed his gun at the police. As he was 20 or 30 yards away, the guardians of the law thought that they had a good chance of foiling a hold-up, so 2 of them drew guns and commenced to fire. So obviously you can see here that this account is saying that the police fired first, whereas the official police account said that the IRA fired first. So moving on, at this point, their attention was drawn by the men on the offside who had their guns levelled at the interior of the cabin. I began to realise my unfortunate position, for if they were forced to fire, I was just as liable to be on the receiving end as a hapless quartet on the driver's seat. While all of this was flashing through my mind, I began to act fast. I focused my attention on the nearest man, who was Inspector Johnson, and told him to get out. He obliged all right, but not of his own volition. He toppled across my left arm, knocking me on the street, and dove head first onto the cobblestones, an inert mass. While I was gazing at him, the next man, Detective Sergeant Sturton, clattered down the step and was about to fire when I winged him in the arm. He made a grab from his gun, which fell from his grasp at the momentarily paralysing effect of the bullet, but as it was near my feet, I kicked it underneath the prison van. When I took stock of the situation, I began to feel more confident that we had it well in hand, so I could keep these 2 men under control. I wasn't aware that the inspector was dead. The rest of the boys should be able to contend with the rest. However, all things were not equal. Constable MacDonald and the other men were still blazing away, and to make matters worse, the car was beginning to roll backwards down the steep hill. Our gallant squad had not succeeded in making much of an impression on the steel door of the vehicle, and they had begun to fire into the lock. Everything was going against us just when victory seemed to be in sight. Suddenly, my captain signalled me from the far side. I mistook the signal for take cover, so I went back towards the path and put a lamppost between danger and me. After a couple of minutes, I realised that the column was withdrawing, and as the captain was still signalling at me to get back, I knew that he meant for me to retire. With a quick glance around to ensure that none of my men required help, I retired up Rotten Row. The following account of the ambush by Michael Carroll is similar to that of Mooney's, with both men claiming responsibility for injuring Detective Sergeant Sturton. As the van came up and changed gear, it was the old gauge change. The position I had was right at the rear of the van, about 30 feet from where the van had stopped to change gear. It was then that Sean Adair and Raymond Mooney came out to hold up the van. Sturton fired through the windscreen. The minute he did, there was a reply, and Johnson fell mortally wounded out the side. I saw him lying there. Sturton ran round to the front of the van across on the far side. I took cover behind one of the standards, or the lamp standards. I saw him coming. I took a random shot. I got him in the arm and the gun fell from him. He lifted it and ran back under a hill. Cooney then relates what O'Carroll went on to tell him. While the men in the front attacked the escort with the driver, another party attempted to smash open the rear door. Sean Coyle, who was a hefty man, was given a sledgehammer. If there was any difficulty in extracting the keys from whoever was in possession of them, his job was to smash the lock off the door. But after some minutes of strenuous effort, he failed to smash the lock off the door. In increasing panic, one of the attackers fired at the lock, but it would still not budge. O'Carroll continued. Ross, the driver, fair play to him. He crushed himself down and threw his machine into gear and drove away up the street at a slow pace. We had to be careful in the crossfire not to get the man we were looking for shot in the van. The van wheeled right to the gates of Juke Street, which were opened in a flash, and the van went right in. Frank Carty, who heard the strenuous efforts to release him, recalls that after being taken from the van, I was severely beaten by the police. O'Carroll describes the aftermath of the attack. What was I to do? I had a Webley in which one shot had been fired, and incidentally, it was the same calibre as Johnson was killed with. I was wearing an overcoat and a cap. I put the gun in my pocket. The van was gone. A man was lying dead. There was no contact from the top of the rear. I was the only one at the rear. I calmly walked down the street, stood at the green tram stop, and got on the tram. I was not working at the time. I was signing on the bureau, so I thought quickly. When I got to the Labour Exchange, it was 12:45 p.m. I signed the register. That came out in the evidence. I went to an Irish house to Miss Cassidy's. I changed my overcoat, cap, and a bit of my appearance. There was no such thing as people running about. I was played out. I had an early bed. But about 12 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. The boys were at the door and I was arrested. I was taken to Central Police Station. DP Walls, Farrah McCrory and John Carney had already been arrested. They had a fair nucleus of those who were involved in the incident. O'Carroll makes a very interesting claim, and one that I was unable to corroborate. Contemplating what would have happened in the event that the jury decided to return a guilty verdict on the defendants at the trial in Edinburgh, O'Carroll was confident that they would still have been freed. He told John Cooney that Michael Collins had sent the squad, also known more fancifully as the 12 Apostles, over from Dublin, and they were staying out in the Calton. This was an elite unit whose job, with Doyle Cabinet sanction, was a highly dangerous task of eliminating those whose knowledge would have nullified the work so far achieved. This happened to every previous freedom movement in Ireland. Part of its job is to try and rescue prisoners. This happened on the 14th of May 1921, when the unsuccessful attempt to free the leader of the North Longford flying column, Sean McEwen, the blacksmith of Ballinallee, from Mountjoy Jail, using a captured armoured car. O'Carroll claimed, "We knew they were on the outside. We had the whole thing worked out." A few spine-shivering moments were experienced by the prisoners. Ellis, a hangman, sized, this is O'Carroll, Ellis, the hangman, sized us up in Juke Street Jail before we went for trial. We were told by one of the warders that this was the procedure. They took our height and various things like that. That was the atmosphere when we went to trial in Edinburgh. Incidentally, John Ellis carried out the execution of the Irish patriots Roger Casement and Kevin Barry. Significantly, O'Carroll asserts that of the 12 prisoners who were put in trial, Frank O'Hagan having been released, broken help, only 4 had not participated in the ambush. As might be expected, headquarters in Dublin were far from happy about the Glasgow rescue attempt. According to Joe Booker, Collins, I was told, was greatly annoyed with Walsh over the arrested volunteers and the attempted rescue of Carty, who was in Glasgow, he claims, without authority. This is corroborated by Patrick Mills and other volunteers who states DP Walsh was recalled and reprimanded by Michael Collins for the loss of the arrested men and dislocation of the organisation. Having said that, I examined DP Walsh's pension application and the detailed questioning he was subjected to in order to corroborate his involvement over different periods, and there's no mention of him having been reprimanded. Just thought I'd mention that. Okay, so just kind of what happened afterwards then. I can't get into a lot of detail. It's in the book, but there's a few ones I'd highlight. Frank Carty, within days of his attempted rescue, Frank Carty was brought in charge of an imposing RIC escort to Dublin and lodged in Mountjoy prison. He was later court-martialed in Kilmainham jail and was sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. That's him there now as a TD. Penal servitude, but was released during the truce in August of 1921. Carty threw himself wholeheartedly on the anti-treaty side and was to become the most prominent Republican leader in County Sligo as the officer in command of the South Sligo Brigade. In this role, he was to lead numerous military engagements with former comrades in the Free State Army. Sean Adair, a sensational sequel to the prison van episode, was to be enacted on the 13th of July 1922 in County Sligo. Sean Adair, who'd joined the Free State Army, was on his way to Athlone when he was killed, and another volunteer, Sweeney, fatally wounded when the IRA ambushed the convoy that he was travelling in. The irony of the circumstances of Adair's death was that the men who killed him were under the command of Brigadier Frank Carty, whom Adair had attempted to rescue in the attack in the prison van. So that's one of the tragedies, if you like, of the Civil War. The political career of Frank Carty was no less distinguished than his military record. He was first elected to the second Dáil for East Mayo and South Sligo whilst in Mountjoy jail in 1921 at the age of 25 for the Sligo-Leitrim constituency. In common with other TDs opposed to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, he upheld the abstentionist policy and did not take his seat until August 1927, when he followed De Valera into Leinster House as a founder member of Fianna Fáil. He was returned with an increased majority in each of the subsequent general elections until 1938. Carty was virtually self-educated and he studied law and was called to the bar in 1936. He died in September 1942, aged 45. Father McCrory, as we'd seen, received a hero's welcome after his release from Juke Street Prison in July 1921. A committee was soon set up and a presentation organised in his honour. Contributions flowed in from the parish of St Mary's and indeed from all over Glasgow and the west of Scotland. Father Pat's mother and sister were guests of honour at the presentation in St Mary's Chapel Hall, which was thronged by the Irish Catholics of Glasgow who wished to pay tribute to their young curate, whom they felt had been so cruelly treated. A costly chalice and a substantial cheque were presented to Glasgow's most popular citizen, close quotes. The chalice, made of silver and dipped in gold, had P.S. The S was for Simon McCrory engraved on it. Father Pat acknowledged the presentation, said, "Politically, as a Sinn Féiner, I have nothing to complain of. I got just what was expected from British police, and I can mention the names of other priests, Canon Magner and Father Griffin and others who received harsher treatment. They were killed by British forces. As a priest, I have to complain of their sacrilege. The authorities of Glasgow did not know what they were doing when they arrested me before 12 o'clock that night. They knew it. I will never forget the kindness of the priests and people of Glasgow. But despite the joy that followed Father McCrory's release from prison, his story was not to have a happy ending. He died less than 3 years later after surgery for appendicitis on April 11th, 1924. Detective Sergeant George Sturton. D.S. Sturton lived with his wife in Springburn until his retirement from the force. I'll just put his photo up. Oh, sorry, that's Sean Adair. I should have shown you that. He was killed in the Civil War. That's Father McCrory there, and that's the headstone over his grave in Killyclocker Cemetery, just outside Roma. Yeah, so that's George Sturton, an older life, and at the time he was at the ambush on the left there. Just on him, he retired from the force in 1936. He later moved to Ayr, where he died in 1957. Kind of euphemistically states that due to the politics of the time, neither D.S. Sturton nor Detective Constable MacDonald was decorated for their bravery during the attack in the prison van. And I should mention, looking at some of these pension applications, one in Sean Flood in particular saluted the bravery of D.S. Sturton, standing over his comrade Robert Johnson, fired at the attacking party. And D.C. MacDonald was later promoted to the post of Chief Constable of the Lanarkshire Constabulary. That's a photograph showing a reunion in the 1940s of veterans of the Scottish Brigade of the IRA. I'm just going to mention here, the Dublin-based Sunday Press newspaper carried an interesting item in its edition dated 27th of February 1955. It announced that the prison van raid will be recalled and stated that only 12 remaining participants were still alive, and that one of the prominent officers involved in the rescue attempt, 56-year-old Dublin businessman Seamus Fullerton, would attend. The talk was organised by the veterans of Sean O'Glenagheran Brigade in Alapin, which was the Scottish Brigade Old IRA Association, and was delivered by Eamon de Barra to a packed audience at 196 Pearse Street in Dublin. Unfortunately, I was unable to locate a report of the talk. What I actually did get, I have, is it was a demonstration of the ambush. Very interesting. It had all had crosses on it for where the volunteers were all positioned, and it had the wall and the prison, the high street. And I was a bit excited about that because I thought it might have been an original plan, but I subsequently discovered that it was just a demonstration aid for that talk in 1955. I'll just briefly mention that in 1934, after Fianna Fáil kind of brought in new legislation for the kind of pension act, if you like, and that came about because initially in about 1925, when the Military Service Pension Act came in, because of the politics, it was a free state at the time, then the people who got pensions really had to be kind of aligned to the free state. If there were Republicans, they were overlooked. That's what happened. So a lot of Republicans left Sinn Féin in 1926, and then in 1932, Fianna Fáil came into power, so they renewed, updated the legislation, and that therefore gave access to a lot of the Republicans, anti-treatyites, who kind of supported De Valera and Fianna Fáil, not entirely though, could then apply for a pension. So to facilitate that, then you had what was called verification officers, who were former officers in different brigades, and then you had like Old IRA associations formed, and that's where the Scottish Brigade Old IRA Association came about. And really it was just to try and ensure that their comrades got the pensions they were entitled to. They got their medals. We could get an Easter one for being in the Rising if they took part in that, and they would get the one for being involved in the Tan War period. And one of the things was there was a lot of bitterness. There was the split in Ireland replicated itself in Scotland. You had the IRA and you had those who followed Collins' instruction to join the Free State Army or Irish National Army, and that happened. So there was a split in Scotland. But one of the things was that when this old IRA association was formed, that veterans were willing to put aside their differences, despite what happened earlier, and they were united in looking at what they would have seen as glorious days in Scotland, and they wanted to ensure that their comrades got what they felt they were duly entitled to. Not that it necessarily was that much, but that's another story. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. Just going to say a wee bit about the van itself. This is just a wee report here. I discover a ghost in East Kilbride was a heading of a remarkable story that was published in the 31st of March 1961 edition of the Glasgow Evening Citizen. The story's author, Neil Stewart, commented, "I'd been out to East Kilbride to see a ghost, the faded, scarred remains of a Black Maria, that was in the headlines 40 years ago when Sinn Féin bullets ripped into Glasgow's High Street. He continues, Grey Duke Street Prison was a black cloth then. Today the setting is richer and greener, for the Black Maria, built into a weekend hut, stands in a field close to hen coops beside ancient Craig Mill water mill. Mr. James Stewart, the present miller who showed the bullet scars on the door, does not know how the van with the turbulent history got to East Kilbride or when it arrived, but it has been used by a succession of families who have enjoyed weekends, possibly unaware that their shelter was once a target for vicious gunmen, it states, and that a policeman had been shot. He then went on to summarise the ambush story. I followed up that story in a telephone call to the Mr. Stewart had passed away by that time. So I spoke to his widow in December 1993 is when I was doing my research for this book. She actually remembered the newspaper story and was aware of the significance of the prison van, which was actually one of 4 Thornycroft models acquired by the Glasgow Police Force. She told me that the van was sold at auction and was purchased by a Mr. James Tennant who had lived in Carntyne. She believes the van was brought to Craigmill sometime between 1928 and the early 1930s. Mrs. Stewart actually slept in the van and said she found it comfortable. She remembers the iron bars still being on the windows. The huts were popular and were mainly used at New Year. It was customary for men to sleep in tents and for the women to occupy the huts. Mrs. Stewart recalled that a woman called Betty Tennant was the last person to use it. As a result of the newspaper story, souvenir hunters would show up and remove splinters of wood from the van. The holiday huts went out of fashion and the hut fell into ruin and was vandalised. And the huts closed around 1974 or 1975 and the van would have been disposed of afterwards. I'm now going to move on and mention about the ballad, The Smashing of the Van, which some of you will be aware of. So that's immortalised in a street ballad, the episode called The Smashing of the Van, a ballad of the Glasgow Irish. When I was researching the book, I was given the impression that the late Mick Garngad, or Mick McLaughlin, who was a native of the Garngad district of the city of Donegal roots, that he had written the song. He was a well-known raconteur, poet, songwriter, practical joker, and a popular figure at wakes. However, I subsequently learned from a taped interview, which I have, with Michael O'Carroll, who took part in the ambush, that the ballad was actually written by someone called Matthew Bird, who was a young poet and a ballad writer of Donegal roots. Sadly, I couldn't find anything else that he had wrote, but he'd actually penned this really quickly, because when the men came back to Glasgow after being released from Edinburgh High Court, and they had reunion functions in the different parts of Glasgow, that song was actually sung at them, so it was really quickly penned together. You don't hear so much about it now, much of it nowadays. And the song was published in the 1967 edition of the Rebel Cayley Songbook, which I have. It's a collector's items. It also contains a foreword by Hugh McDermott, the acclaimed Scottish poet. The ballad's also published in the Songs of Past and People by the Triolan Community Arts and Association of Midwest Radio and Knock Folk Museum in County Mayo. And apparently in January 1981, the ballad was broadcast on Radio Erin from Wexford. And the Irish Brigade, who mistakenly, they gave the ambush the 12th of May, and there's actually a verse they miss out as well, but they've recorded it and it's actually on YouTube. And Paddy, can I just ask you if you could play it, please? Now, Can't hear it, Paddy. I don't know if you started it yet.
Sorry, 2 wee seconds. I thought it was playing there.
It's all right. We're nearly finished, folks, anyway. Thanks, Paddy. Oops, wait till we see. We're coming to the end, so you might be glad to hear. I'm just going to find a place on this. Wait till we see now. Yep. So that was a smashing of the van. You don't really hear it sung so much these days, which I feel is a bit of a shame. Okay, so moving on. I'll put a slide up there. That's Juke Street Prison, just as you're coming to the brow of the bell of the Brae at the top of the High Street. You can see that on the left. Where those women are walking down beside the wall, that approximately is where the bullet marks are. So the forbidding building that was Juke Street Prison was demolished to make way for the Ladywell flats in the 1950s. It's interesting to see the corner there's a kind of turret. If you look at that, the prison wall just in that image, see right behind that at the corner, that is where the actual gallows stood, where people were hung. The cut down remains of the boundary wall survived the bulldozers, but the reduction removed the stones in which bullets were visibly lodged. But bullet holes can still be seen in the lower section of the wall where the ambush occurred. I do myself and my colleague Keith, I should have said I'm the secretary of the 1916 Rise and Sea Centenary Committee Scotland, and twice a year, generally about May Day, in May obviously, and in September for Glasgow Doors Open Day, we do a Glasgow and Irish Revolution walking tour, and we visit a whole lot of spots that have a connection with the Irish Revolution. We visit IRA drill halls, Sinn Féin, site of Sinn Féin premises and various things like that. And one of the things we do is we go up to the prison wall, so that was one of the ones we did. And I was just kind of explaining there the whole story of the smashing of the van. The late Glasgow historian, Jack House, some of you might remember, there used to be a column in the Evening Times called Ask Jack. He liked to make a point of taking visitors up to the High Street and telling them his version of the rescue bid. He would then invite them to put a finger in a bullet hole. He stated that in his book, The Heart of Glasgow. Some of you might be familiar with it. But he states in there, he says, at the end of the day, when I had shown them the wonders of this wonderful city, I would ask them what impressed them most. Almost invariably, each would reply, putting a finger into a bullet hole in the wall of Juke Street Prison. So there you are. So just moving on to the conclusion now. Any assessment of the rescue attempt would have to concede that it was a failure in several counts. Not only was Frank Carty not freed from the prison van, but he also suffered a beating by the police in retaliation for the tragic unintentional death of their comrade, Inspector Johnson. It was officially stated that the 4th of May was the first time for many years in which any police official accompanying a prison van had been furnished with firearms. But obviously the police weren't taking a risk in respect of Brigadier Frank Carty. The anxieties expressed by Liam Mellows, the IRA Quartermaster General, on his visit to Glasgow, that an ambush would jeopardise the smuggling of arms and ammunition and lead to a clampdown on the IRA, proved prophetic. As the Daily Record put it, it was not until an afternoon in the month of May 1921 that the people of Scotland were brought to realise the immenseness and the thoroughness of the Irish Republican movement in Scotland. An old book found in a Glasgow tenement disclosed a list of firearms and explosives collected from a widespread area. And of course, I'd mentioned previously that the arms cache that was found at 74 Abercrombie Street was quite a considerable loss. The numerous incidents of drilling filed in police reports that took place in remote places like the Campsie Hills and Cairman Hill, and both in Dunbartonshire, had deflected attention away from the more serious business of swelling the IRA's armoury. Several high-ranking officers were detained, and there was a corresponding reduction in IRA activity in the period that followed the arrests. The success of the police in arresting a significant number of men that were in active service on the 4th of May demonstrated that the intelligence forces had a pretty firm idea of the identities of leading IRA personnel in the west of Scotland. The Defence Committee was unable to pay all the legal fees for the Defence Council. Mackay and Sandyman were the two principal ones, and there were disputes about who should be paying the fees. As late as October 1922, a request was made to the Cabinet of Dáil Éireann to grant £4,000 in order to cover all expenses incurred in Scotland. The attack in the van was planned without the knowledge of the Army Executive, which, if it had been consulted, should probably have rejected it. The official IRA plan to rescue Carty at sea would seem to have had a better chance of success. And both Seamus Reader and Michael O'Carroll felt that had it gone ahead, then the anti-IRA outcry that accompanied the trial could have been avoided. In an atmosphere of urgency, given that Carty was under sentence of death, together with the need for on-the-spot decisions, individual initiative, organisation and leadership, there may have been an element of confusion. According to Sean Flood, Carty's record had endeared him to all his fellow soldiers of the IRA, and those on the spot decided to make an effort to effect his release. Commandant D.P. Walsh was probably right when he told Charles J. Mcguinness that to call off the Glasgow plan would shatter the whole Republican movement here. By the time he arrived in Glasgow, as we know, the plans were already advanced, and the idea of holding up a prison van and rescuing a high-ranking Republican would have been a far more exciting prospect than the routine drilling and acquisition of arms and munitions that the volunteers were accustomed to. I should add that a lot of volunteers in Scotland requested transfers to Ireland, especially when the guerrilla war started. They were frustrated by the fact that they couldn't, because the Scottish Brigade had representatives in it, or members from every county in Ireland, and obviously they were getting reports of what was happening, and they were keen to see active service in Ireland. But it was rare to get transfers, simply because GHQ recognised that the work that they were doing was absolutely important. So much so that Joe Vyse, I think in 1925, actually stated that 2/3 of the weapons, the war materials that were used in Ireland to arm the soldiers and the forces in the field, so to speak, actually came from Scotland. So that in itself gives you an indication just how important Scotland was to the war effort. When asked by the advisory committee, that's the pensions people, as part of his pension application, if the ambush was worth it, this is Eamon Mooney talking here, he said, "The glory and honour of it was, in that time I did not mind." The IRA volunteers who took part in the rescue bid cannot be blamed for the failure of the Glasgow plant. Some of them, maybe most of them, didn't even know that it wasn't official, because they wouldn't necessarily have been privy to that information. It'd only been the senior officers would have known about that. But it has to be said that they showed intelligence, maturity and courage despite their youth. Their community regarded them as heroes, as was shown by the huge welcome home functions organised on their behalf. The fact that the friends and families of the arrested men were willing to perjure themselves in a Scottish court showed they had immense loyalty to Ireland and her government in her hour of need. The President of the Irish Republic, Eamon de Valera, acknowledged this solidarity in 1922 when he addressed the Irish in Scotland. He said, "Of all the children of Irish race in foreign lands, none has been more faithful than you in Scotland." Many of the men who served in the Scottish Brigade and later returned to Ireland look back on their time spent in active service in Scotland as glorious days. Michael Carroll summed up his opinion of the Glasgow Irish when he said, "The people of Glasgow in the west of Scotland, the first, second and third generations of the Irish, I will always remember them, their loyalty, their sincerity and the ideals which were in their minds. They were wonderful." Whether or not one agrees with the men of 1916 and their successors in the War of Independence, no one can deny the courage and determination of these men and women. They were deeply committed to the cause of Irish freedom, and many of them suffered greatly for their idealism. After a world war that was supposedly fought for the rights of small nations to self-determination, which was only another word for government by consent, Britain's position in Ireland was politically untenable. The purpose of the War of Independence was to drive that point home beyond recall. And it was a war that need never have happened had Britain not been so willing to grant Ireland its national rights. Writing the book and giving talks like this on the subject, I hope I have given some recognition, not only to the boys who attempted to smash the van, but also to the thousands of unsung and forgotten men and women of the Scottish Brigade of the Irish Republican Army, Cumann na mBan, na Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, and the wider Irish community who were faithful to Ireland and the Republican ideal during the revolutionary period from 1916 to 1921. And I'm just going to close with saying I'm actually working on another book on Scotland and the Irish Revolution. And I've got a publisher called Mayhem Tales who do wonderful publications on Irish revolutionary history, 1798, 1916, Tan War. If you get a chance, visit their site, called Mayhem Tales. Michael Devlin there does a wonderful job, and he's agreed to publish my book. So my goal to get that out in November, and that again, I'll give recognition to all these men and women, because obviously this is just about one episode, probably the best known episode that happened to that period, but there's a lot more besides. And as a hidden history, it's a history that's most people don't know anything about. And I want to try and address that. That's why I brought the book out in the first place. But this subsequent book, obviously, will give a lot more information, and it'll cover the various brigades, companies, battalions in Scotland. So I'm just going to finish there. So thanks for your time. I didn't realise it would run on as long as that. So thanks for your patience as well. So I'll stop there. Okay. So, Paddy, is there any time for questions? I know we gave it 2 hours, so is it going to end, or do you know what's going to happen?
Yeah, there's time for questions. Yep, no problem at all. If you fire all the questions, that's no problem.
There's one that came through. Someone asked, where can you find the pension applications for volunteers from Scotland? There is a website. It's Irish Military Archives. If you just Google it, you'll find it. You need to spend a bit of time figuring out how to negotiate it. There's a lot of information on it. But you'll come to a section for the pension applications, and it's basically a search engine. You put in the name of the person, surname, first name, and just do a search. And if the pension file has been digitalized, then it takes you to it. You can then download it and read it, and it's absolutely fascinating. This is a work in progress. The people involved in that archive have done a tremendous job. It's absolutely fascinating, and there's been various releases, various tranches of files, and I'm always kind of very keen to look through them, because always obviously an interest in the Scottish volunteers. Even if people are unsuccessful in their pension application, it'll still eventually go up. I mean, the other way you can do it is if you've got a reference number for the pension application and it's not up yet, you can actually arrange to make an appointment and physically turn up. It's at Cahill Brewer Barracks. It's old Portobello Barracks. It's in Rathmines in Dublin, North Dublin. And you can make an appointment and you can actually go and physically go and look at the pension files, and they are very, very detailed, and the questions were very, very thorough. That through the various periods they had to be able to answer, and references were provided by their officers and all that. So it's really good. So I would encourage anyone to have a look at them, and it's not just Scotland, it's in other overseas units. It's also obviously throughout Ireland. And then there's also, apart from that, there's witness statements as well that were more detailed, that were made in the 1830s and 40s about the involvement of volunteers in Scotland and as to their various involvement, because I had to give, in order to get the pension, I had to be able to evidence their involvement. And as you can imagine, it's an absolute boon to historians having access to that. And obviously, the more accounts you've got by different people, and it's corroborating stuff as well, and it's so helpful to have access to that. So it's a wonderful resource. The other thing I would say is I have a copy of the Scottish Brigade membership roll. There's got about 2,500 names on it across about 31 companies. And one of the pleasures of doing all this, since I wrote the book back in 2008, and also having the Facebook page, the 1916 Rise and Centenary Committee Scotland Facebook pages, I've had a lot of people who have been related to members of the Scottish Brigade who have contacted me. Some of them weren't sure if they were, and it's always a pleasure to be able to check out the archives and come back to them and be able to tell them as much as I can. Not all the time. Sometimes they weren't so involved, or maybe they weren't Sinn Féin or whatever. But I'm still happy to do that. If anyone was to contact me, I would check out that for them and come back to them. You know. So I see there's some questions. So I'm just going to have a wee look. Des Dalton in Dublin, congratulating Stephen on a highly detailed and informative paper. Absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Des. I appreciate that. Just delete that one now. I'll move on to the next one. Thank you. Very interesting. From Jean. Thank you, Jean. When your book is published, do you have plans to advertise it using the participants tonight? I don't see why not. I should have the email addresses and I can send out an invite. I should say the intention is to have a launch in Glasgow. When I had the launch for the High Noon and High Street, it took place in Borders, which is sadly no longer there. But we'll have a launch in Glasgow and one in Dublin, definitely in Dublin. A lot of the relatives I've found of volunteers going back to Ireland, and there's quite a few of them in the Dublin area. Scottish Brigade Old IRA Association, which existed from 1934 to the early 60s, met in Dublin. And obviously I want to try and raise awareness in Ireland itself as to the existence of a Scottish Brigade and its contribution. Just reading on, someone asked, has this been recorded? I'm pleased to say it has been recorded, and it's going to appear on YouTube, and I'll put the link up on the 1916 Facebook page, and so people can have access. I know there's a number of people who weren't able to make it tonight, or people had to get away and stuff like that, so you'll be able to see it, listen to it. It'll be on there soon. Is it possible to? Are you planning another walking tour in Glasgow once the rules allow? I don't see why not. If there's enough interest, and there always has been, I'll be very keen to do that again. As you say, once the restrictions have eased, so hopefully maybe starting from the summer, we can advertise again. It'll be on the 1916 Rise and Centenary Committee Scotland's Facebook page. I'll put them on there. Or if anyone wanted to contact me and there's enough interest, I've had that before, maybe people coming over from Ireland and they've asked, could you put this on? And I've taken them. I've even done the, just on the Smash of the Van. So if there's an interest there, then yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, that's everything that's there. Has anybody else got any questions? Well, as I say, maybe. Well, the other thing is, I got a kind of rerun done of High Noon and High Street. So there's another batch printed there, and it's always been in circulation. I've deliberately kept the price down I think it's £8.99, just to make it affordable, because it was never a commercial enterprise. It was really just to get the story out. And over 3,000 copies have been sold, which is pretty good, because it means that, and one of my objectives of creating an awareness of the episode, that's hopefully has succeeded. But it is still available. Carlton Books, which is a radical bookshop in the Barras, they sell it. They sell quite large quantities of it, actually, and you can get it through other online sources. And it is a scenery. As you know, the Centenary is coming up in May. I'm going to try and get some articles and maybe some of the newspapers and things, even just to try and raise knowledge of it in the wider kind of Scottish community. Okay, is there anything else? No, that seems to be it then. So I'll just say thanks very much again for your patience for listening to this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. I certainly found the whole experience of researching it and meeting the relatives and whatnot has been very uplifting, very, very personally rewarding. And, you know, it was dangerous times, but the Irish community in Scotland certainly stepped up to the plate. And it's not always recognised in Ireland itself, it's not always known. So it's really important that the contribution is acknowledged. And by turning up for events like this, then you're helping that process. So thanks again, everybody. Okay then, Paddy, do you want to just wrap it up then? That's 9:10 anyway.
Yep, that's great. Thank you, Stevie. Really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for joining. And I'll see you all later.
Okay, thank you.